Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to Professor Mary Corcoran's inaugural lecture, From Delivering Justice to Generating Justice, how we can remake relationships after crime and punishment. Now I'm standing in as chair I'm standing in for the Dean of the Faculty, Donna Lee, who unfortunately can't make it tonight. But I just want to say it's really nice to be able to do this for a long time colleague. Myself and Mary have been in many different schools together, and as with many colleagues in the room, and I'm sure we might be in one or two more in the future. And I think we both started out as lecturers at Keele, so it's really nice to be able to introduce Professor Corcoran at this event. Anyway, I'm just going to say a few words in introduction, and then we'll move on to the main event. So Mary Corcoran is an economic migrant and a late developer in academia. She trained as a journalist and worked at several jobs before returning to university and obtaining her PhD at the age of 40. Her doctoral thesis, based on interviews with Republican and Loyalist women prisoners about their experiences of prison resistance, sparked a long career interest in the agency and capabilities of criminal justice experienced people. She has led several projects with vulnerable prison groups, women, the bereaved, older prisoners, that have influenced the design of gender responsive and community-based services for these groups. Mary has made a pioneering contribution to the study of voluntary sector and NGOs in criminal justice. This work supports thinking and practices of agencies in developing humanitarian programs for diverting people from prison to supporting them to live with less or no conflict with the criminal justice system. Currently, Mary is leading research projects around the concept of generative justice, which presupposes justice experienced people as agents of change, as distinct from being only subjects of rehabilitative or penal intervention. This work explores generative and solidaristic practices that can be constructed by and among justice-affected people through peer work, arts and creativity, and relationship building in a variety of collaborations. She's an academic advisor to leading charities, professional bodies and policymakers, sits on editorial boards for major journals and has held visiting fellowships in the UK, Australia and Israel. She has published 60 academic papers, edited collections and books. And so, without further ado, I'll hand over to Mary to deliver her keynote presentation, inaugural presentation.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you. So thank you, everybody. I am so privileged and delighted to see you, and little nervous, little bit of a frisson, but I want to thank all of you for coming to hear this talk, but also because in so many ways many of you have given me such a valuable hand along the way. So I want to send out a big group hug to all of you and a thanks to all of you collectively. There are a few people, however, that I would like to mention specifically. And firstly to my wife, Tidy, who reminds me that she's been with me, alongside me, at all stages of my career, from PhD widow to faculty wife. I also want to thank Keele University for this opportunity, for the promotion. I came to work at Keele because of its standing as a centre for critical research into the harms caused to people by powerful interests that are often not dealt with or even reinforced by the criminal justice system. And I hope that as professor, I will continue to sustain the pursuit of knowledge and the company of friends, as the Kiel motto goes. To my colleagues, my criminology colleagues and my broader colleagues past and present, thank you very much for your brilliant work, for your research and teaching, and to be able to work alongside you. But I also want to salute our collegiality and our solidarity, which are the real binding forces of an institution, and in a sense that comes through in what I'm going to talk about this evening. To those who have experienced the criminal justice system, and to those who work with them, who've entrusted me with their knowledge and who've educated me about their experiences over 20 plus years, I hope I do justice to your work and to your trust. Shout out to Dan and the audiovisual crew, to Julia and the catering and housekeeping team. Many thanks. You've made this gathering comfortable, and I hope everybody's beveraged up. And most of all, I want to dedicate tonight's talk to the memory of my parents, Martin Patrick, MP, and Mary Corcoran. Strange Bedfellows, a true story. So in September 2008, a quarrel broke out in the letters pages of the national press in England. The subject was the involvement of several charities in two rival groups which were bidding for government contracts to provide two new build prisons, Belmarsh South and Magill West. The first consortium was composed of the for-profit corporation Group 4 Securicor, G4S, Galliford Try Construction, and two charities, NACRO and RAT. The other was the security corporation Serco, partnered by the charities Turning Point and Catch-22. Now, it was hoped that securing a contract would mean that the participating charities could have greater influence over the new prison's ethos and regime. It also meant that the financial heft of the private sector would, they hoped, develop better and more ambitious programmes for prisoners, bringing about a progressive and lasting model of rehabilitation that could be replicated in future. Now, the prospect of charities embarking on a major venture with transnational security corporations to construct and run new prisons exposed them to charges of charity washing by allegedly profiting from punishment and by advancing the then government's ambitious prison building programme. Some responded with disbelief and shock. Their peers expressed surprise at the prospect of major social care charities competing with each other to build prisons. They warned that this would align the charities with the priorities of their paymasters and with government policy, in the process compromising their independence. Others blamed the cutthroat climate in which contracts for criminal justice services are currently decided. Still others cautioned, rightly as it turned out, that this latest development augured a collective loss of nerve, making it all the more important to keep well-organised lights burning for sane and rational policy making during periods marked by regressive and authoritarian regimes or agendas. So the charities involved had to defend their plan and reconcile its far-reaching implications with more conventional charitable purposes. So the chief executive of NACRO conceded that while their co-contractors made strange bedfellows, their role was a big breakthrough for both the charitable sector and for prisons, as he argued, because it helped to plan the regime from the start, which will result in high-quality rehabilitation and resettlement. Prisoners will be much better prepared for reform. Now, these charities also argued that the risks of crossover between care, treatment, and coercion could be avoided by a division of roles. The charities would avoid direct involvement in the disciplinary regime. The security companies would employ prison staff. The charities would operate therapeutic, substance misuse, and rehabilitative programs. This maintained two pretenses. First, that differences in the nature of interventions or levels of vulnerability are not relevant. Secondly, that ethical or power relationships in sensitive areas of justice can always somehow be managed. Now, this incident didn't confirm the voluntary sector's conversion to hyper-competitiveness, growth, and utility as the terms for participating in criminal justice work. But it was a notable transitional milestone. An imagined progressive reformist consensus was being credibly challenged by an emerging new realism, one defined by what these charities thought of as an entrepreneurial outlook and political pragmatism. Because it was obvious to all sides that a new settlement was forming around different normative expectations, and that this marked the end of the so-called Golden Age. That Golden Age was one of voluntary sector expansion on the back of state-funded welfare in the aftermath of the Second World War, towards the great unsettlement that followed the shake-up of the welfare state, post-Thatcherism and post-New Labour. This shake-up was accelerated by the financial crisis of 2008 and the austerity politics that followed it. And the effects of these crises are still present and visible today. Just looking at the quote there on the PowerPoint, at the same time, the very idea of the state was changing from one of providing social services to that of auctioneer of public resources. Governments believed that public sector reform required leveraging the strengths of charitable and private sectors. And as part of this new mixed economy, more and more areas of work in prisons, probation, policing, community sanctions, substance misuse, education and secure housing, amongst other services, were subcontracted to charity and for-profit sectors. This is a speech which was delivered by the Director General of the Confederation of British Industries in the aftermath of the financial crisis of 2008, where John Cridland is making exactly the argument that I've made, that the state needs to change from becoming a provider to a manager of public service markets, and this is a pivotal moment for criminal justice, because this diagram comes from a report, again issued by the CBI, but actually supported by a number of the very largest charities. And the big blue balloon kind of shape is what the report called zones of opportunities. They were the areas of public sector services that had not yet been outsourced. And they include prison, police, and probation services, and those criminologists amongst us know exactly what happened in the ensuing 10 years to those and many other criminal justice services. So the zones of opportunity available in a mixed market. Meanwhile, the penal system was expanding as governments demonstrated their tough approach to crime and to the causes of crime. More and more, criminal and antisocial behaviours were subject to a mix of civil sanctions, restraining orders and police interventions. These responses fused behaviours labelled as antisocial with criminality. So these measures also drew large numbers of people into the criminal justice system. Our prison population has almost doubled since the 1990s. However, there is no simple connection between rates of crime and rates of imprisonment. Rather, as many societies have become more unequal, they have become more punitive. So most prisoners, even now in the men's and women prison estates are adults who come before the courts charged with persistent or prolific acquisitive crime, that's property crime, such as theft, or for drug dealing, prostitution, and so forth. Their law-breaking is connected with untreated ill health, addiction, violence, and poverty. These are the nuisance people who cycle in and out of the prison system, serving repeated short-term sentences. Once released from custody, where they are often deprived of the means to regain their footing in society, they're likely to return to prison within a year. And still another trend was unfolding. A new moral order was emerging which took a distinctly punitive approach towards socially and economically precarious groups. Community safety and security now focused on re-establishing a grip on populations that were being pushed into the cracks and ditches of society. The social contract was being rewritten around norms that divide citizens into two groups: the socially integrated, who make responsible life choices and are not dependent on public welfare, and those who allegedly exclude themselves from that bargain. This was also the age of the community turn in politics, as voluntary and charity groups were increasingly regarded as shock absorbers for austerity and the hollowing out of neighbourhoods. So we can see this in the policies of consecutive governments, where they extol a politics of giving and volunteering. In Tony Blair's compact of understanding with the voluntary sector in the 90s, through to David Cameron's rather listless big society. It continued with Theresa May's very short-lived shared society, and recently Keir Starmer has been reviving this idea in his proposed society of service. So I've argued that by the turn of this century, the contemporary criminal justice voluntary sector had reinvented itself into a distinctive subsector in direct response to these developments. A coalition of umbrella groups, lobbyists, policy influencers, and think tanks produced reports and analyses that were optimally positioned to promote the status of the voluntary sector as a partner in crime reduction and law and order. Because the truth was that many voluntary agencies welcomed opportunities to step into that space. They saw greater potential in attracting private investment, to develop programs with flexibility and freedom to operate the way they wanted. Closer partnership with government also offered a route to renewing the sector's public role and relevance. Given these contexts, the focus on whether charities should be involved in running prisons was being overtaken by events. The unthinkable was happening. So therefore the questions became how, why, and on what terms or to what degree were voluntary sectors adapting to a new criminal justice and financial landscape. Sorry, just thought I'd... So these questions were the focus of a large-scale project which I undertook pre-COVID, it has to be said, and there have been a few, but not many changes, on where we were looking at the adaptation and resilience of different charitable organisations working in the criminal justice space. How were they getting on? How well were they adapting? To what were they adapting? If one accepts that the landscape was radically changing, and I've just laid out that to all intents and purposes they were responding to what they were reading as radical shifts and radical changes in their context, in the context in which they were working. So we were really concerned with two, if you like, intersecting questions. The first concerned the advances and strains involved in reconciling charitable mission with commercial survival. And the second was related to the opportunities, conflicts, and accommodations involved from working in penal and criminal justice domains. And we found that charities were adapting to four separate but overlapping drivers. Marketization. This is where social work in criminal justice was transformed into spheres of competition for contracts and funding. Greater competition encouraged charities to pursue new client groups or go into new areas of work, a phenomenon which is known as chasing the money. The winners were those agencies that increased their funding capture, with some growing rapidly to regional and national scale through mergers and acquisitions. The losers were those who struggled to compete on the same terms. Local cooperative ecosystems were undermined through wariness that former collaborators were now competitors. But instilling entrepreneurial values and mindsets took a great deal of persuasion, and staff responded with ambivalence or outright reluctance. Now, by contrast, most managers held that efficient business practice is not incompatible with altruism and the public good. However, they conceded that as their work was increasingly measured by commercial success, the tensions between social mission and survival became starker. Professionalization was about preparing organizations to restructure their internal cultures, skills, missions, and practices in ways that were congruent with the goals of efficiency, economy, and performance. Staff and volunteers were trained to work to the specifications of contract delivery, targets, and performance metrics. Payment by results incentives prompted a tendency towards gaming success. The fixation with outcomes devalued the status of relationships and caring in interactions with people using their services. This offended workers' sense of their skills and occupational values. Demands from funders for endless, meaningless, and selective data promoted a sense that their jobs were being reduced to the production of workplace bullshit, as Graeber puts it. Quite familiar, I think, in areas of human service beyond the charitable sector. Penal drift charted the many ways in which charities absorbed criminal justice frames and attitudes, especially as penal mandates were introduced to their programmes. For example, individuals may attend addiction treatment or domestic violence perpetration programmes as an element of their court sentence. Non-attendance or non-cooperation are prone to sanction as a breach of sentence, which may result in the client being recalled to prison. Now, providers are usually contractually obliged to monitor and report on clients' progress. Now, some reasoned that sanctions are necessary to secure client engagement for their own good. Others said that it facilitated tacit cultures of coerced care. It might be countered that these are hardly serious sanctions compared with those available to probation officers or to the police, but they are severe relative to their previous approaches and ethos. Disconnection sprung from a widespread sense of having strayed from their original missions and roots. This included territorial dislocation, as agencies took on contracts outside of their home areas, and also worried about protecting their local market share. Many complained that the sector's voice was being stifled by contractual gagging clauses. This restricted them from publicly commenting on issues such as the impact of government policy on child poverty or crime and victimisation. Post-Cameron, governments are increasingly and visibly intolerant of perceived criticism by civil society actors. Having in 2014 passed legislation to curb advocacy or campaigning as a form of political lobbying on the same basis as corporate lobbying, and to sanction recipients of government funding for what are deemed to be political activities. And these are early indicators of, I think, the more openly hostile stance that the civil society organisations are experiencing at the moment, and I'm sure we can think of some very recent examples. So we concluded that charitable resilience, such that it is, confirmed that the sector was surviving, but at extensive cost to its sense of social purpose. Now, of course, not everyone aligned with these prerogatives, and there was a great deal of the performative in outwardly affiliating with these agendas. Trustees and staff engaged in elaborate dances in order to manage conflicting rationales. And submerged in their storied pains of adaptation, we found that people continued to quietly draw on values and practices informed by human rights frames, economic justice, and critiques of inequality. In short, many of the so-called old values did not go away, but remained present in the reconstruction of new structures. That being said, I have come away from that research convinced that the parameters of resilience are so deeply implicated in deficit thinking as to be counterproductive and damaging. That may be particular to the criminal justice domain. Organisational resilience is fixated on how agencies or communities might better adapt to disruption while minimising the degradation of the public domain or the political clawback of civic self-determination. Personal resilience assumes familiar behavioural pathologies through the pretense that it's possible to ground personal responsibility and attitudinal change without addressing the structural injustices at the root of crime and much victimisation. So my current work, therefore, is how might we move beyond this impasse? And I currently, I suppose, call my current project From Resilience to Repair, Building Back Justice from the Grassroots. So with co-investigators Fergus MacNeil and Beth Weaver, I'm exploring whether there might be better ways of understanding how and why individuals or communities might be involved in justice building, but in ways that work outside dependency and state institutionalisation. Now, from our separate work over decades, we knew of several instances where healing, recovery, and acceptance are built by criminal justice involved people to a significant but often invisible degree. We want to understand how criminal justice affected people may be agents of renewal and recovery. And we want to develop practices that are better able to build or repair the human capacities and social relations damaged by crime and by criminal justice processes. We argue that forming relations of solidarity matters greatly. Why? Because crime itself is a source, a sign, and a symptom of relational problems. When we harm one another and find ourselves in conflict, relationships suffer, and relational work, therefore, needs to be done. So we've proposed a concept praxis which we call generative justice, and it's up there on the screen. The word generative has roots in the Latin generare, to beget or procreate, and I like to think it's got good kind of feminist resonances to it as well. It also denotes systems through which meaning can be structured, agreed, recognised, and shared in social domains. And to the psychologists amongst you, I am not using generative in the sense that Erik Erikson or Erich Fromm might. I feel unfit to deploy any kind of psychological concept. So we're using it in a particularly, if you like, social scientific manner. So generative justice describes prefigurative, which are very early stirrings, early steins, emerging practices that are to be found in communities, movements, and organisations that respond to crime and punishment in ways that are generative of social relations characterised by solidarity recognition, reciprocity, and inclusion. Now, we're not claiming a new theory, at least yet anyway. And that'll be interesting. You know, it's always interesting going to a criminological conference and say, oh yes, what is generative justice and how is it distinct from other forms of justices? And of course, there are a plethora of theories of justice, and I suspect that many of them oscillate around what we're trying to do. But instead, we see it as a kind of intellectual scaffolding for our network of activists, practitioners, and academics, some with direct experience of the criminal justice system. They're part of a contemporary flourishing of solidaristic movements who are designing responses to insecurities and inequalities with imagination and an alertness to systemic injustice. Projects include prisoner-led educational programs, community farms, food cooperatives, projects involving music making and the creative arts, housing collectives, and social enterprises. Structures of solidarity have not been destroyed in the era of punitiveness, economic shock, nor political populism. Indeed, they may have been strengthened in a pushback against individualism, alienation, exploitation, and endless striving. So our position is that justice-making starts with building solidarity. There is a need to develop the generative potential of acts of recognition, acceptance, inclusion, and solidarity with others. Building such relationships is both intrinsically valuable and creates conditions which bring people to reimagine future selves and better lives. And it's skilled and serious work. It demonstrates that you can build relationships with people without condoning what they've done or what they may be doing now. In fact, I would say it demonstrates the necessity of building relationships with people without condoning what they've done or what they're doing now. So therefore, the questions become what kinds of connection are to be found among justice-involved people. How might the qualities of sociality underpin solidarity and lead to justice? What kinds of justices are created, and how can these be imagined and constructed? So I want to turn to my own project, or a project in which I'm involved with a local organisation. And the initial seed corn funding for this, thankfully, was provided by the Keele Institute for Social Inclusion. So I hope we spent your money responsibly. So the project partnership is a collaboration involving my colleagues and I, August, which is an NGO that provides relationship building facilitation programs, and Walk, a resettlement project with a Christian ethos. And I'm really, really delighted that our friend Karen Edwards from Walk, who has given me permission to talk about and name the project, and I'm delighted Karen's here tonight. Thank you so very much. Now, normally when I'm talking about this, I talk about Stoke-on-Trent being a so-called post-industrial legacy city, but I think we all know the depth and magnitude of the exclusions and challenges of poverty in our city. So Walk offers homes, skills, and employment to men after they leave prison. Their aims and practices are intrinsically about relationship building among staff, residents, and visitors. The project's core ethos is based on 4 generative principles. Servanthood, which they describe as getting stuck in, offering to help, not seeing any job as beneath you. Humility, which encourages all to be patient with team members. Compassion, because we all thrive when cared for. So look after yourselves and others. Do everything with love. How often do you go into an organisation that says do everything with love? Okay. And fourthly, unity and peace, which is based on communication, which is the key to living peacefully with one another. So we ran workshops on social storytelling for residents at a stage when they are moving on through the project, which can be really fraught and difficult. The programme has progressive stages. These include an initial phase of intensive recovery in a detox home, a second period of living in the recovery home, a third phase of shared living in houses of 4 to 5 while engaging in structured activity with the project. And this is the stage at which the workshops take place. And then the final stages of semi-supported living in residents' own apartments before moving to independent life with a job or prospect of employment. Now, the storytelling workshops included activities such as Tale of My Shoes, an exercise where participants talk about where they got their shoes. Try it sometime. Just try it, honestly. It's an amazing exercise. Free writing, drawing, acting out scenarios, and bringing a gift, where participants discuss an object which they treasure and why. Borrowing elements from social dreaming, and with some therapeutic dimensions, the storytelling part offers structured opportunities for participants to co-create and shared narratives in a social space using associations and links contributed by the whole group. Social stories, therefore, comprise both the collective process of making stories and producing these stories as objects in their own right, and the metaphor for the method as a container for holding painful and difficult encounters also attests to the mutual recognition and encouragement that the technique draws out. Everyone present, including researchers, facilitator, residents and staff, attending, participates in activities. No extensive notes are taken, so the data comes from drawings, flip chart notes, creative output, including this as an example of an amazing piece of work. This is a huge piece of work. It's 2 meters by 1 meter, and it captured our very, very first workshop. It's a wonderful piece of work, extraordinary piece of work, and an artifact and a documentation of what generativity meant to the residents who took part in that particular workshop. Now, my research interest is on the generative nature of this process and of the community in which it's situated. And I map these to existing theories of justice, both social and criminal. This draws attention to the prefigurative, that is, the earliest stirring of change which are necessary for envisaging better futures for oneself, or future states of non-conflict with others or the criminal justice system. Translating desire into consciousness as part of generating the necessary self-recognition which grounds a person's altered identity. Because social storytelling is concerned with betweenness and transience and suspended states, it offers really important clues to those fragile moments. Likewise, social storytelling can be seen as a political play, a form of political play where participants act out different and more hopeful ways of being through creative experimentation and improvisation. And here established habits of thought and being can be unlearned and new ways in thinking tried out. Nearly there. Of course, in the real-world experience of many people, desire is only part of the process of personal change. Desire may never develop beyond feeling and therefore remain unseen and unrealised. Further, if self-determining change is to be meaningful, there must be the possibility of choice, refusal, and exiting. Converting feelings of desire into expressions of change is fraught with uncertainty. Outcomes may be dependent on what material circumstances, social supports, or recognitions a person has access to or not. Put another way, we must recognise the enormity of the existential leap which people have to take to build trust in the possibility of a livable future. To paraphrase the philosopher Martha Nussbaum, living good lives involves trusting in the good of others in the face of our mutual precarity. This obliges us to embrace uncertainty and acknowledge our vulnerability, and therefore binds us in responsibility to and for each other. I just want to end with the voices of the residents, and I thought I'd give you a couple of examples of the poems which we produced, the found phrase poems. Name. My name is old. My mother wanted to give me a middle name. Children had their names removed in the care system. I know your names because you tell me your stories. Your names are important to me. Trainers. My trainers are a statement. You attach an image to an emotion so you'll remember it. These are my reward shoes. My shoes were eating my feet. They had no soul. I loved my Mickey Mouse trainers. These are my spiteful bastard trainers. Here and now. So many different masks, that's me. It's a private joke, it's common knowledge. Time to grab hold of hope. Your feelings can dictate what you think is real. It's an illusion. We're channels for each other's emotions. Love is the common denominator. They break your values down here. It can be very comfortable to be the outsider. You have the privilege of the last line. Thank you, everybody.